Welcome to She Rebel Radio, a community-driven podcast dedicated to supporting women to unlearn conventional rules and create businesses of significance. Each season, She Rebel Radio brings you insights and advice from noteworthy women entrepreneurs who strive to create more meaning, impact, and purpose. Now here is your host, Lulu Minns.
Welcome to episode 84 of She Rebel Radio, The Rules of Lee Miller with Ami Bouhassane. Ami is the granddaughter of the iconic Lee Miller, who is a role model of mine and an original She Rebel. Lee started her career as a model for Vogue magazine before becoming a photographer herself and later one of the few female war correspondents in the Second World War. Ami is not only the author of several books about Lee, but the co-director of Farleys House and Gallery Limited, which houses the Lee Miller Archives, Penrose Collection, as well as Farleys House and Gallery, where Lee lived with her husband, surrealist painter Roland Penrose. And many of their friends from the surrealist art movement visited them at the house, including the infamous Picasso and Man Ray. I worked there just after leaving my legal career, which was an incredible experience in connection to Lee and her family after being a fan of her work and life story since I was about 16 years old. Lee refused to follow the rules made for women in her lifetime, and Ami shares with us just how. Ami, it's amazing to have you here. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. It's very nice to be here.
Oh, it's an honour to have you. And I know this is something we were discussing prior to COVID and pandemics and things like that. And we're finally speaking today. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, me too. It'll be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you tell us firstly how Lee's couture modelling career got cut short after she appeared in the wrong kind of advert for a fashion model at that time? It's one of my favourite stories.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in those days, you didn't have modelling release forms like you do today. And she posed for a picture by a well-known photographer called Edward Steichen. And he then gave it to an agency. And then the picture was sold on to be used in an advert for Kotex, which is a women's sanitary towel, like Tampax in America. And at this particular moment, she was already considered to be what would be the equivalent today of a supermodel. And it appeared in various magazines, and she was advertising this product. It made it the way they worded the advert, it sounded like she personally endorsed it as well. And you're talking about late 20s. I think it was March 1929 that it came out. And at this point in America, women's products like this had only had descriptions or drawings associated with them. And she actually, by chance, was the first woman to ever have her likeness associated with a product like this in America. And at this time, it was seriously taboo. And, and it killed her career as a model overnight, really. Nobody wanted the Kotex girl modelling their posh frocks anymore. And that was it. As a model in America, her career was pretty much dead in the water.
Yeah, it's crazy to think, isn't it, in terms of it being such a taboo subject, and Lee finding herself being the face of that, and ending her career. And what did Lee decide? She decided that she would prefer to take the photos anyway, and was quite determined, wasn't she, to convey and express her own ideas rather than be the object of men's ideas. So what did she decide to do when her fashion career kind of ended in the way that it did, and how did she go about getting behind the camera instead of in front of it?
I mean, she I always admire her because she never let things kick her when she was down. She never let things, she always, instead of kind of sitting there and moaning about having a ruined career, she chose to turn it into an opportunity and used it as an excuse to leave America and go to Paris and start off as a photographer there. She already had a little bit of work from Condé Nast and from various other people. She actually first went to Italy and did some drawing and things there of was it fashion accessories. So she wasn't going without any kind of work. She, because she didn't come from a very wealthy family, she just couldn't go to Paris or to Europe on a whim. But then she decides to go to Paris and apprentices herself with Man Ray, who she knew at the time was one of the top photographers. She already had an interest in photography because her dad was an amateur photographer, and she always she had that kind of mechanical kind of engineering and inquisitive brain. Anyway, her dad, he's a bit of an odd character, but what you can't take away from him was the fact that you're talking about, she was born in 1907. He treated her right from the beginning the same as her two brothers. She had an older brother and a younger brother, and he would he was an engineer. He would encourage her with her brothers to make go-karts and a kind of weird inventions. When she was 7 years old, he gave her her first chemistry set, and which was really kind of advanced then, at a time when girls were taught to sew and cook and things like that. He fostered in her this idea that this inquiring brain, and it really, she continued with it.
Yeah, and served her well. And that was at a time where girls were told, that they didn't have the right to the same education as boys and all of that stuff. So it's amazing to hear how her dad fostered that, and also how Lee knew then, for women who weren't in business as they are now, that she could utilize the network she created to create a new opportunity for herself in Paris.
Yeah, totally. I mean, she was not stupid. She had this amazing way of making these connections, because, I mean, Steichen, the guy that took the Kotex advert, she got him to write her a letter of introduction to Man Ray, and that's how she got her foot in the door. And she'd known Steichen since she was about 10 years old, but she kind of utilized this network right through her life and builds on it.
Yeah, created opportunities for herself. And she was kind of working with Man Ray and a partner to Man Ray for around, was it 3 years?
Well, yes, she was kind of intensely with him for the first year, so 1929, but by the end of by September 1930, I mean, so this is really only working as a photographer for a year, really. She was already being published in Vogue, which has incredibly high standards for a photographer. And you can see her, she has her own work being published and credited to her in American Vogue and in French Vogue, and even British Vogue paid for her to go to Britain in early 1930 to do a shoot for them. So her commitment and the quality of her work was really quite quickly recognized. And actually by 1930, she had her own studio, which is incredible for a woman at that time. Dora Maar, who's a photographer and an artist, she was also doing the same kind of thing, but she felt that she couldn't sell her photography without using a man's name. And so she actually settled in her studio about a block away from Lee's, and she shared the studio with an architect designer, and his surname was Kiefer, so she put her name with his name. And so her early fashion photographs, Dora Maar's early fashion photographs, are signed Maar Kiefer, because she felt that she couldn't actually sell herself as well. It was that tough. It was completely unheard of for a woman to have her own, and as a photographer, which is only now becoming more more equally represented with women.
Because I was going to say, I don't know if you know the ratio of female photographers in Vogue magazine at that time. Lee must have been one of the first.
Yeah.
And also I was going to say, Dora Maar was the last exhibition I went to before COVID hit. I went to the exhibition in February 2020 when life was a little bit more normal than it is now.
Yeah, me too. It was the last one I saw as well.
Yeah, I actually went on my own, which I don't usually do. I took myself on a date and it was amazing, and it made so much sense when March happened.
Yeah, I mean, Dora Maar's work's phenomenal, and it makes sense that she and Lee kind of knew each other and were friends. And you know, people credit Man Ray with Lee, and often her Paris period, which is from 1929 to 1932, is completely written off as being Man Ray. And but actually she was working in her own right, and she was, you know, it was tough. She had to work. She took jobs working as a photographer for surgeons. She still modeled because she had to still make ends meet. It wasn't like suddenly, I mean, you know what it's like in business. You don't suddenly say, yeah, I'm going to be a photographer, and you get all the clients and everyththing's hunky-dory.
Yeah.
She really had to graft, you know, she had to graft to make it work.
Yeah, absolutely.
So she's still modelling. I mean, the French didn't give two hoots about the Kotex ad, so that was fine.
Open-minded.
Yeah, they were way, you know, not at all like the prudish Americans at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, that's where Lee opened her first photography studio, you said, in the 1930s. And we've already established, you know, a time when women really didn't run their own businesses. We've heard about Lee and her dad, you know, but what do you think gave her that confidence to ignore the rules for women at that time and to just do it anyway?
I don't know. I think she just decided that she just had this kind of strength in her that was like, well, if they can do it, then I can do it. Why can't I do it? It was very much of a, well, of course I can do this. Don't be ridiculous. And she really wasn't going to let anything stop her.
Those invisible rules did not apply.
No. And I think she, you know, she had a very unfortunate experience when she was 7. I don't know if you want me to say this on
Yeah, no, please do.
She had a very unfortunate experience when she was 7, and it's, you know, I mean, it's quite, her mum was, we only know from family stories, but we know that her mum was having some kind of what everyone has described as a nervous breakdown. We're never going to know really what was going on, but her mum was having some mental difficulties, and Lee and her brothers were sent to stay with various people, and Lee was sent to stay with some friends of the family. And while she was staying with them, she was raped. And not only that, but she was infected with gonorrhea. And this is before penicillin was invented. So for a good 7 to 8 years after that, she had to endure really painful treatments to keep the gonorrhea at bay. But also, it was a huge secret, because, you know, in those days, it was very much the kind of, you know, the culture that actually it's the victim's fault.
Yeah.
It would bring shame on her family and on her. So it was a massive secret. And I think she just got very angry about the whole thing. Yeah. And it really gave her this conviction to, I mean, after that, she got expelled from school about 3 or 4 times. She was not going to take that kind of, she always, after that point, she would question authority if she didn't believe what they were saying. And it installed in her this feeling about truth and justice. In fact, the only school she wasn't kicked out of was a Quaker school, and their values are very much about truth and justice. And yeah, I think she has that root as well installed in her that kind of solidified this belief that she wasn't going to be held back by these ridiculous things that society put on you.
Yeah, not having that trust in, the systems and structures and authority that exists. And
Yeah, I mean, it had failed her already.
Mhm.
As a little girl of 7 years old, it had already failed her. So why the hell should she abide by their rules?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I saw you mention around International Women's Day, and we also have a celebration on She Rebel Radio at that time as well, that Lee really did have a strong network of female friends and colleagues. You've already mentioned Dora Maar.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
she
why is
did.
that important to her, I think?
Oh, it's important to all of us, I think. I mean, when we look back at the archives and how we have had to work to become, for her to be re-recognized in the world of photography,
Mhm.
people have always placed her with the male artists, and oh, Picasso painted her, and oh, she knew Man Ray, but actually she had this amazing group of women around her
Mhm.
that were so supportive. I mean, after the war, when she was really badly suffering from PTSD after all that she'd seen in the death camps as a war correspondent, one of the really big friends to her was the artist Dorothea Tanning.
Mhm.
And they made friends in America, in Arizona, when Lee met her in 1946. And Dorothea was there for Lee in the really tough times when she was learning to have to live with these kind of demons in her head.
Yeah. Yeah, and as you say, so often, women, are before being artists are seen as the muse of male artists.
I hate that word so much.
I know. I've actually got a She Rebel Radio episode of becoming your own muse, instead of somebody else's. But then, as you quite rightly say, Lee's really been associated with the male artists that are famous, and almost being given her credit or value through them rather than her work, and also who she was connected with in terms of the women that supported her and were doing incredible work as well.
Yeah, I mean, another woman that was, I mean, she had a couple of childhood friends that were particularly Tanja Ram, who she was friends with at the Arts League in New York as a student, and she became a model. And Tanja also came with her and stayed with her in Paris for a while. And Tanja actually was, if you want to say, Lee's muse in a way. And
Mhm.
Lee does a lot of her experimental nude photography of her friend Tanja. And I think when you have that kind of friendship and trust between two people, you can really experiment with your work, and that's very evident in Lee's early work
Mm.
with Tanja Ram.
Amazing. What did Lee say about women as photographers? Did she believe, and artists for that matter, but did she believe that we brought something different to the table? And if so, what?
Yeah, she did actually. I can't remember exactly what she said, but I mean, this is again when she leaves Paris and decides to go to New York. She's not even arrived there, where she's already set up that she's going to have a studio, and she's promoting her. She already knows that if she is going to be a success, you have to walk the walk and talk the talk.
Mhm.
So she has already got this whole raft of newspaper articles coming out about her, and she's trading on her sensationalism about how she's trained in Paris.
Mhm.
And one of those early articles, I think it's on the 4th of November 1932, says in it, she says, I think women are better suited to photography because we have a better eye, or something like that. Yeah, I think she's right.
Yeah, yeah. I think, did she say something about intuition as well? I think.
Yeah, intuition, that's it. Yeah, intuition. And yeah, that's totally right.
Yeah, yeah. So it's yeah, and I think I read somewhere as well, and I don't know how accurate it is in terms of it's also the personality of the photographer that matters, and not just the technical ability. So Lee being so full of life, I imagine brought that into what everything she did in terms of getting what she needed out of her subjects, and what it was or who it was she was taking photos of.
Yeah, totally. And I think it helps that she had a modeling background as well, so she knows what it's like to be in their shoes.
Mm.
And I think we've been working a lot in the last year with her British wartime fashion photography, and you can really see that she has a rapport with the models, and a lot of them are much more relaxed, or she lets them have a bit more of a personality than she really kind of should, which I think is quite nice and shows her a different type of style to other photographers at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did Lee end up becoming one of the only female war correspondents in the Second World War, which resulted in a very infamous photograph of her being taken in Hitler's bath on the day that he shot himself?
Well, when Britain declared war, she had literally just moved to live in England with Roland Penrose, who would later become my granddad. And obviously America took a little while to join the war, but she felt, and she wrote to her brother John saying, I fought most of my life and worked so hard to have a life in Europe, meaning particularly France and America, France and England. That I don't feel, and I've got a life there, and I've got friends here. I don't feel like just because there's not enough butter to go round that I can leave them. So even though she's getting letters from the American embassy saying she needs to go home, she stays, and she says, maybe with my camera I can do something. Yeah. And she starts working she actually volunteers initially for British Vogue, and she becomes their main photographer of fashion. And I think she just is desperate to be more and more relevant. A lot of the articles that she does about kind of promoting make, do and mend, then there's this awful government thing a report that comes out saying about how hundreds of women who are being scalped because their hair is getting caught in the machinery, as they're working towards the war effort. So she and Audrey Withers do a whole raft of articles about trying to make what previously long hair was previously fashionable, trying to make short hair fashionable, trying to make turbans fashionable. So to try and help encourage women to take notice of these safety issues. And when America joined the war, she already knew a Life magazine war photographer called David E. Sherman, and he said, she tried to become a war correspondent with the British Army, but they refused because they didn't take women. But David Sherman was like, well, you're actually American. Why don't you try the Americans? And she signed up. She kind of told Vogue she was going to do it. She didn't give them much choice, but it was just her mission. She wanted to do as much as she could, and she wanted to be the one that, and her weapon of choice was a camera. She couldn't carry a gun. She wasn't allowed to.
No. And it sounds like the Americans were a bit more open-minded than we were.
Yeah, they were. I mean, there was, I think, 16 American female war correspondents. But Lee is the only one that we know that, because part of even under the Americans, the war correspondence accreditation for women was different from men, and the women weren't allowed to cover combat because we were considered so weak and feeble that we couldn't handle it. But actually Lee, as being Lee, violated the terms and did cover combat quite a lot. She got put under house arrest the first time, but I think they gave up after that.
She carried on, and
she was always looking. She had that kind of great networking brain. She had this way of kind of making connections. She obviously spoke French, so she was really useful to the American army as they were advancing through Europe and into Germany. And it was through her networking with the Signal Corps that she got the tip off about Hitler's apartment and the address, and turned up there just after they'd taken it. And that's where she took the infamous picture of herself in Hitler's bath with David Sherman, the Life magazine photographer.
And I love, as you know, I've been a fan of Lee, your grandmother, for since I was 16, and every time, being at Farley's house and talking to you and reading, you just learn a different layer and depth to Lee and what she does. It's never occurred to me so much actually until this interview, of how much she actually networked and used who she knew to create opportunities for herself.
I think it's really interesting because she did have to think. She was determined to not have to go back home, and she was determined to make a go of her choices and not have to, and to always be independent. And when we've drilled further down into her life story, things like, the story about how she became a model, and how she kind of was rescued from the path of a truck by the magazine, a Vogue magazine owner and proprietor of Vanity Fair, Condé Nast. Actually, I mean, she and he was like, oh, you have the face of the time, and you've got to come and model for me. And as far as I know, that did happen. But she was already connected. She already knew Steichen. She already knew several of the other top photographers in America at the time, and she was already moving in those circles. And I think if that hadn't happened, she still would have become a model. She still would have got there, because she'd already had this kind of network going on. And she's all amazing at the way she does think and plan ahead, and the way she kind of orchestrates how she's gonna, when she goes back to New York, straight away she's thinking, well, I'm going to go back, but I need to make sure that I've got work. So she makes sure that American Vogue have promised her work when she gets there. She gets herself a dealer, so she's got a representation in New York at the Julian Levy Gallery, and he's promised to give her a solo show, which will be selling her pictures. And she's got this whole raft of promotional stuff going out in the papers. Some of it is written by a couple of friends of hers, but she's just using those people that she knows and just thinking forward, how am I going to fund this? How am I going to make sure it works? The first couple of months, 6 months of my business, I'm going to need extra finance. So this show at the dealers, if I can sell some works through that will finance it.
Yeah, and again, just so important for a woman of her time to be savvy to really create that network, but be bold and brave enough to ask people to create opportunities for you, and make sure that happens. Because again, women could be, oh, I don't want to ask for, am I worthy of this, etc. And Lee just went in and did it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, she even issued shares in her New York studio.
Did she?
Yeah. We have one of the share certificates in the archives. We have a number 18, which hasn't been filled out. So there must have been at least another 16 or so shares issued. I have no idea who to.
One day you'll find out.
But it's just incredible, isn't it, that she even was forward thinking, and they're beautiful certificates, forward enough thinking to think about that at that level of funding her own activities.
Yeah, and that level of conviction. And again, me working with female entrepreneurs, and it's come up on the podcast, again, women still have less access to funding for business, and all of that. And Lee was creating that for herself. Going back to the photograph of her in Hitler's bath, how did that photo actually, kind of come about in terms of, being created on such a significant day for the world?
I mean, they had, when they were taking the picture, she and David Sherman obviously had no idea that Hitler and Eva Braun were in his bunker in Berlin killing themselves. It was just a fluke of history that happened. They found they had the address through her contacts in the Signal Corps. Obviously it's the Signal Corps' job and their duty to go ahead of the Allies, ahead of the forces, and to know where there's live electricity, live telephone wires, because they're the key part of what they do is keep the comms going, which is incredibly important for the army.
Mm-hmm.
So they were like, and there's this great place, and it's got electricity and coal and live telephone wires, and if you're coming past, that's the place. Oh, and by the way, it's Hitler's place. And when she got there, the telephones were still working. And yeah, she initially, when my dad asked Dave Sherman about it, he goes, "Okay, so come on, tell me this story about in the bath, Hitler's bath." And he goes, "Well, actually, it was really simple. We stank." We'd been following the Allied advance, and we hadn't had our clothes off in more than 3 weeks, let alone been near anywhere where we could have had a bath, with running water. And suddenly there's this bathroom with hot water, and and clean towels, and we just had to get in, and then we realized it was a scoop, and it's actually set up all on Lee's camera.
Yeah.
And Lee got into, and they rigged, there's a little statue next to the bath, and they rigged that, they put that there. It's actually normally was in a different part of Hitler's apartment, so it was kind of partly to prove where they were, because that would have been in a more public area, so it would have been proof. And also as a kind of comment about how Hitler thought had persecuted friends of theirs like Max Ernst as degenerate artists. And then they also rigged a promotional picture of Hitler by Heinrich Hoffmann on the side of the bath as well. And Lee got in first. But straight away, her modelling career hits, because she knows that if this picture is going to be published, she can't sit up straight in the bath because you'll see her boobs. So she hunches down so that the picture's more modest.
Yeah.
And then looks, she poses looking like she's washing herself with the flannel in the bath. I mean, what's incredibly significant for us, though, is actually her dirty boots that have defiled Hitler's bath mat next to the bath. Before they got there, it was pristine. And when you think about it, a bathroom's a really private place, isn't it? It's the kind of place you do things you maybe want nobody to ever know about.
Yeah.
And so they're in his very intimate, private place, and they're defiling it. And those boots that are covered with grot had been on Lee's feet that morning, and carrying her around Dachau prison camp. Which was one of his death camps, and she was there for the liberation. And she had been taking pictures of dead bodies that were so skeletal they looked like piles of wood that were stacked up in the yard, and recording the absolute horror of the prison camps. And then she'd come here, and in this kind of rage was defiling his place and putting their stamp on it. Then she gets out the bath, and David Sherman gets in, and she tilts the angle so that you can see the shower head of the bath. And they were very much aware, having been to the prison camps, about the Nazi death showers that they kind of rigged up and told the prisoners that they were going to have a shower.
Yeah.
And actually fed poisonous gas through the shower heads instead of water to kind of mass murder them.
Yeah.
And David Sherman was Jewish. So you've got these two pictures, and it's his boots. They swap her boots for his boots on the mat.
Yeah, such incredibly poignant photos, both of those two photos. Thank you so much for sharing the level of depth and meaning behind the photos that they took. Now, Lee, and the photos of Dachau I've seen, they're incredibly heartbreaking, and Lee really struggled with what she witnessed during the war, and also the traumas from her childhood, which she'd covered up so well. She famously said, "I looked like an angel, but I was a fiend inside." What did she mean by that, do you think?
I think she I think, I don't know, I think you could look at it a lot of ways. I think maybe that some of the fiend bit is the hangover for how she had been told or made to believe that she was kind of this devil child because of what had happened to her earlier trauma, or because she knew that she wasn't going to accept kind of the patriarchy, and she was always going to rebel, and that she was fiendish in that way. I think the mental struggles she had also could be could be thought of as being the fiendish side as well, because the absolute horror that she had to live with was terrible. And in those days, I mean, I think we're making progress, let's say, about mental illness and mental health, but there's still a way to go.
Yeah.
And in those days, when you came back from the war, and it was the same for the soldiers, you put up and you shut up. And if you can't deal with it, you have a whiskey. And if you still can't deal with it, you have another. And everyone was just supposed to get back to normal life. And it was completely washed over that these people had witnessed these life-changingly horrific events. And those kind of things are seared into their brain. And nothing was known about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so she'd often have these flashbacks and have to have to deal with them. And it was really, really tough for all of that kind of generation that lived through it.
Yeah, and I think so many of us see that, in our families somewhere. I certainly know it affected my grandparents as well, grandfathers in particular. So thanks again for sharing Lee's struggle with that. And what's it been like for you to be the granddaughter of such an iconic woman and rule breaker, and to make her life's work your work?
Well, it's a tough act to follow, really, isn't it? I mean, she was this. I just love the fact, and I'm just incredibly lucky to be able to work with her stuff. And I love that she's inspiring. And I love that she was this mistress of self-reinvention, and that even though she had some horrific moments in her life, she turns it around and turns it into something positive. And even after the war, when she really had to grapple with the demons, and she had post-traumatic stress disorder, and then after she had my dad, she had postnatal depression. She learns to cope with it and to live with it by completely reinventing herself, hiding all of her photography in the attic, and emerging in the last 15 years of her life as a gourmet cook, and becomes this celebrity. She dies being famous as a celebrity chef and forgotten as a photographer. And it's completely different. And she makes a success of it again. And she has all these lives. I just feel very lucky that I get to work with her stuff, to be honest.
Yeah, and you've written an incredible book about her cooking career, as it were, and her weird and wonderful recipes. Is it green chicken? And I think there's a boob one in there somewhere.
Oh yeah, there's a boob one. But again, I think the boob is her. She'd done some protest photography in Paris, where she'd taken a picture of a severed breast that from one of the surgery. How I mentioned she worked for a surgeon to pay the bills at some point. After he'd done a radical mastectomy operation, she asked him if she could keep one of the breasts, carried it across Paris, and set it up in French Vogue studio. I mean, can you imagine? And on a plate with a knife and fork either side of it.
Oh, and I've seen it. That's coming back to me now.
Yeah, and she got 2 shots off before Hoynigan Hune, who was the studio boss, saw what she was doing and kicked her and the breast out. But it was very much, she was so angry at the time that about being commodified and having her body being exploited, and the men just wanting women for their bodies and their looks, and not overlooking them as having brains as well. That it was like, you want breasts, here you go, have it on a plate. And I think even later on, she's a bit older, when she's reinvents herself as this gourmet chef. She actually, for her 50th birthday, she gives herself a present of going to Paris and studying cordon bleu. And then that's how it all starts. But so she's in her 50s, and I think the boob dish, which is cauliflower breasts, is a kind of throwback to that. But she's kind of realized that you maybe need to be a bit more subtle.
Learning to make it a little bit more subtle. Incredible. Thank you so much for sharing Lee's, incredible story. And what is next for you, Farley's House and the Lee Miller Archives? I know it's been a really tough year for everyone, but particularly the gallery aspect of what it is that you do. And I know much more of Lee's fashion work is being shared, which is my favorite. I love everything that Lee does, but I do love her fashion work. And there's recently been a podcast series about it as well. So yeah, just love to hear more about what you're up to and how the listeners of She Rebel Radio can support Farley's Farmhouse and the Lee Miller Archives and everything that you do.
Gosh, well, we're always up to something. I think it's maybe genetic. But we have a fantastic exhibition that's mostly work that's not been seen since it was published during the wartime, which is of her British fashion, wartime fashion photography, which is open in the gallery at the moment until the 8th of March. And as you mentioned, there's a podcast series which is available through Spotify and through our website, which is called Lee Miller Fashion in Wartime Britain, that you can listen to. We also have an online membership program on Patreon, which is the Lee Miller Archives Patreon, where people can get kind of access to extra material, and the membership kind of helps support us at Farleys and the Lee Miller Archives, because as you said, it's been a pretty crap year. Normally we have about an average of 4 to 5 Lee Miller headlining exhibitions touring the world, every year.
Yeah.
And last year they dropped like flies. This year we only have 2, and next year we currently have none. So it's going to be a long haul, I think, for us recovery wise. It's we normally have shows booked up to 4 or 5 years in advance.
Wow, yeah, it's such difficult times, but we will put all the links to the membership and the podcast series, which is accessible, in the show notes, so our listeners can access all of that, because I know they will be as intrigued by Lee and her work as I have been for well over 20 years. And it's been such an incredible to work at Farley's as I did, and to spend time with the family, with you and Tony and everything. So it's amazing to have you, Amy. Anything you want to share before we go?
The other great way of seeing what we're up to is our Instagram account with Lee Miller Archives. It's at the Lee Miller Archives on Insta, and Farley's is Farley's HG on Insta. And we'd love to see you at Farley's or somewhere around the world with one of our exhibitions. We've got Lee Miller. It's a fantastic exhibition that's opening at the Dali Museum in Florida on the 3rd of July for any American listeners. And they've got this wonderful strapline for it, which is, I think, only possible in America.
Yeah.
The billboards say, "She is Lee."
I love it. I wish I'd almost called this episode that.
Yeah, it's such a good strapline. And the longer title for the show is pretty cool as well. But I just love, we've just signed off on the billboard designs for it. So I have this vision of people driving around Florida with this giant portrait of Lee on these billboards, and it's in big letters saying "She is Lee." And I just wish I could see it.
Absolutely. And it's significant, isn't it? Because I forgot to say earlier, with her photography studio, quite a few people were surprised that Lee was she when they turned up at the studio, because
totally. I mean, because Lee is an androgynous name, particularly in New York. She in Paris, interestingly, she advertised herself as Miss Lee Miller. But when she went back to America for her studio, she didn't give herself a gender. so that a lot of the time people just presumed she was a man, and when she was advertising for work, and she'd get the work off her merits, and then had enough sass to keep the job when they realised that she was actually a woman.
And again, savvy enough to be aware of what culture she's in and how to play it.
Well, exactly, and that's another really important part of being successful in a world that is skewed against you.
It definitely is. Thank you so much, Amy. We will speak to you soon.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to She Rebel Radio, the podcast for women unlearning conventional rules and creating their businesses of significance. She Rebel Radio is executive produced by award-winning coach and advocate Lulu Mins. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to hit subscribe. And if you're feeling social, find Lulu Mins and the She Rebel Radio community using the links below.